most recently as a team lead at Acquia. I've been working with Drupal since the early days of Drupal 6, and I've also done a fair bit with agile methodologies, Kanban, but predominantly in here we're going to be talking about Scrum. Couple assumptions before we get started. First off, this was an intermediate track session, so I'm assuming everybody in here is familiar with Scrum, standard Scrum practices. That when I say product owner, when I say acceptance criteria, everybody has a sense of what those are already. I'm also starting from the presupposition that there are no free features on our websites. Even after we've deployed them, development's done, we've got them out and live on the site, there's some level of maintenance that has to be done. We've got to keep Drupal core and contrib up to date. If we're relying on any third-party libraries, JavaScript, Symfony packages, we've got to keep those up to date. So even once a feature is out the door, there's some burden inherent in maintaining it on the site. If nothing else, because it means that when we're developing the next feature, we've got to make sure to consider the existing features, so that we don't accidentally create regressions in existing features. So there's, if nothing else, a little bit of additional development overhead involved. And I guess as a caveat, for purposes of this talk, I use the term story and feature pretty interchangeably. So, standard Scrum practice. Start with a groomed backlog so that the most important priorities or the most important tickets, the most important work is at the top of the backlog. At the beginning of each sprint, we essentially cut the top off that backlog, pull it into the sprint backlog, develop it, ship it, repeat the process. So where does the feature value monitoring that I'm talking about fit into this? Right about here. What I'm saying is that after we've got our sites shipped, the features are live, what we need to be doing that seems like frequently we're not, is evaluating the features that we've already deployed onto the site to make sure they're actually providing the value we expected them to. And then if they're not, we need to consider whether we need to feed that back into our product backlog. The logic there being that the most important, the most valuable work should always be at the top of our product backlog. If we've already said that a feature is, at one point was the most valuable thing for us to work on, we've got it live, and then we find out it's not actually meeting the value we expected it to, there's a good chance that fixing that feature is going to be more important and more valuable than what's already at the top of our backlog. What happens if we don't do this? Well, there's a chance that features aren't doing what we expected them to do. The users aren't using the form. We're not getting the engagement we expected. Whatever the value of the feature was initially supposed to be, for all we know, it's not happening. It's not providing that value. And if we're not watching it, we don't know. It means we've got a site that's technically correct. It's met all the acceptance criteria. Client's happy, but it's not actually doing what we wanted it to do. Which means that essentially we've got wasted time, wasted effort, wasted money. It also means that we've got essentially a bloated site. If we've got features that aren't doing what we wanted them to, those are dependencies, those are features and extra work that are not providing value. And so really we'd want to be able to get rid of those. This becomes especially important in Drupal 8. previous versions, moving from Drupal 5 to Drupal 6, Drupal 6 to 7, 7 to 8. As a developer, we could always pretty much count on those major version updates being significant enough that it was easier just to build the whole site from scratch. Rebuild the whole thing from the ground up and get rid of all the cruft that had accumulated. With the new versioning system and semantic versioning process in Drupal 8, the plan and the vision is that that's going to be less of, major version increases will be less of a dramatic shift, as we go from 8 to 9, at some point in the future from 9 to 10. So we can't necessarily count on being able to use that version change as the justification for building the site, from scratch in a greenfield manner. But most importantly, if we're not evaluating our features after they're deployed, as I said, there's a good chance the subsequent work that we're doing isn't really the most important, the most high value. Which means as product owners, whose defined role is to make sure that we're providing the greatest value of the product, if the work we're undertaking isn't the greatest value, we're kind of failing in that capacity. So, I've kind of already given the answer to this one, but who's supposed to be doing these assessments? Now, ideally, we would think that whoever's sponsoring the feature would be evaluating the value of that feature after it's deployed. If your digital strategy group wants a Twitter integration, you would think that they'd be coming back and after that's deployed, evaluating the feature and making sure it's doing what they expected it to. What I've seen is that's not generally the case. And so the burden of doing this assessment falls back onto the product owner. Now, before we get into how to do feature value assessment, let's talk about when do you not need to. I'm going to make the case that there are 3 times you don't need to. The first is when the maintenance burden for that feature is essentially 0. 9 times out of 10, if you've got a feature that has a 0 maintenance burden, it's probably not important enough to actually need to do a value assessment on. Case in point, we want to provide a block in our footer that has the physical address of the agency. There's not a lot of value in going back and making sure that feature is providing real value, because the burden of maintaining and updating that block, keeping the address up to date, is trivial. And as an aside, if you guys are building sites on Drupal and updating the address in a block or something is not trivial, come see me, because whoever built your site's doing it wrong. So, if the maintenance burden is 0, don't bother, following up and doing a value assessment afterwards. Second case is if the value has been proven before development started. This usually means you've done focus groups or you've done usability testing before defining the requirements and doing actual development. In those cases, the focus groups and the usability testing should have been proving the value even before any of the work was done. So it doesn't make sense in those to go back and reassess the value after the fact. The third case, and frankly this one I'm a little hesitant about, and we'll talk about that in a second, is if the feature is mandated by either regulations or managerial fiat. For instance, is everybody familiar or remember the Open Data Initiative from the Obama administration? Made the case that by default, agency data should be open and publicly accessible. You can make a presumption of value that simply by complying with that mandate, there is there is value in the simple compliance. We don't have to verify that people are actually using the open data we're releasing. Certainly that would be a valuable piece of information to have. But for the feature of complying with the mandate, the value is simply compliance. The bit of this that I'm hesitant about is this fiat piece. We've all had bosses that come to us and say, do this because I say do this, and I think this is going to be the best thing ever. Yeah. It would be nice to be able to say we're doing this because the boss said we do it. The boss is happy, we don't need to evaluate this feature. The risk there is that you can easily end up with the kind of sacred cow features on your site. The thing the boss thinks is going to be great and is very valuable, but is potentially a non-trivial maintenance burden, and for all we know is actually providing no real value. The fiat bit, it's really, I would say it's a judgment call as to how valuable you feel doing an assessment of the feature value afterwards is going to be. My recommendation would be evaluate based on the burden of the feature. The higher, the bigger the pain this feature is going to be to maintain going forward, the more likely and the more strongly you should consider actually evaluating the value of that feature once it's live. So, how do we do feature assessment? 6 steps, pretty simple. Start off, figure out what your assessment plan is going to be, what you need to look at, how you're going to evaluate whether this feature is actually providing value. Record your baseline data, because in most of the features that we're going to be evaluating, we're looking at a comparison over time. For instance, this feature is going to increase the number of retweets we get on Twitter. This feature is going to reduce the number of complaints we get on our feedback line. So you want to be taking a before and after, so you can be able to show the change based on the feature. If you really want bonus points, consider statistical significance when you're thinking about before and after. If our Twitter, if in July we had 1,000 retweets, we deploy this new feature, and in August we have 1,200 retweets, does that mean our feature is working? Or is that just kind of natural variance in, this month we had particularly intriguing content? So, once we've got our baseline, then once development's done, then we're ready to deploy. We deploy the site, or the feature rather. We're going to conduct an assessment, essentially running our assessment plan to see what the value is. We're going to react based on that, respond to it. And then periodically, we're going to need to repeat steps 4 and 5. And we'll talk about that repetition in a little bit. Now, you'll notice the figuring out the assessment plan is actually before feature deployment. That's not accidental. We want to be figuring out the feature assessment plan before we even do the development work for the feature. I'd recommend doing it at the same time, when you're grooming a story in your backlog, you're writing out acceptance criteria for the story, figure out what your assessment plan is at the same time. 2 reasons for that. First, if you can't figure out how to evaluate the value of the feature, is the feature really thought through enough? Is it really inherently valuable? Secondly, in order to assess the value of the feature, you may need to actually do a little bit of extra development work. For instance, we've got a button on our we're adding a button on the site. To assess the value of the feature, we need to see how many clicks that button gets. Well, we may need to add like Google Analytics instrumentation so that an event is sent to Google Analytics every time that button's clicked. We may need to send data over to like hosted Graphite or some other monitoring tool so we can see how often that feature is actually being used. Okay. So what makes a good assessment plan? Now, I tend to not be a very warm, fuzzy kind of guy. I think it comes in part from being a developer by background. But I'm going to tell you one of the key features in an assessment plan should be that it's quantitative rather than qualitative. I want to see numbers rather than phrases like it's better or improved. Should be affirmative rather than negative. It's hard to prove a negative, so we want to phrase our assessments in ways that instead of saying something didn't happen, we can say something did happen. Again, it's kind of tied to the quantitative rather than qualitative. We want to look at facts rather than figures. Facts rather than feelings. So instead of saying, for instance, people will be happier with our agency, we might say that submitted feedback will show a sentiment analysis average of plus 0.5. If anybody's not familiar, sentiment analysis is just kind of a data science way of taking the words people use and turning them into a numerical score of how positive or negative a statement is. But most importantly, the assessment needs to fit the feature. Every feature is going to be slightly different. Every agency is going to have slightly different tools available to it. So we need to make sure that instead of kind of getting into a rigid step of this is how the assessment needs to be, maintaining some flexibility and ability to kind of adapt so that our assessment actually accurately covers whatever the feature is written to be. That said, there are some kind of topic areas around which features tend to group in terms of what their value is. So the first of those I'm going to say is engagement and use features. For example, as the Office of Digital Strategy, I want to highlight my agency's Twitter feed on the site so that more of the public engages with us on Twitter. The words themselves say this is an engagement type feature. But for this kind of feature, what we want to look at are things like, in the specific case, social media analytics, but more vaguely, or more generally, we could look at page views. We could look at the bounce rate of how many times, how long someone stays on our site. Most basically, if we're talking about a feedback form, then we're looking at the number of form submissions. This one's probably the easiest case to assess. But there's also there's a subcategory of this to cover offline engagement. For instance, if we're highlighting events in a calendar on our site, how many people are showing up to those events? Obviously, unless we have a reservation system, that's not something that we're going to be able to capture directly in our website. We may need to be taking roll or something at the events themselves so that we have that kind of attendance data to be able to feed back into the assessments. Another category is in process improvements. For instance, as a citizen, I want to submit my tax forms online so that I make fewer errors when filling them out and I get my refund sooner. For these, we want to look at things like what are the abandonment rates if we're looking at like a multi-step process. The classic example is, Amazon's got a shopping cart. You add stuff to your shopping cart, you add stuff. At some point, you're going to check out. They'd be looking at what their abandonment rate is. How often do you put stuff in your shopping cart and never actually check out? You just kind of decide to go off elsewhere or get distracted and it never gets done. For the specific story, I might look at form error rates. How many times does somebody have to, fill out fields and hit submit before they get it all right and the form submits successfully? Or even process completion time. A side benefit of this particular story is that humans don't have to process pieces of paper. So in theory, we should see that electronic submissions reduce our human labor, and we're able to get refunds out to people more rapidly. To check that, we need to look at how long does it take somebody from the time they finish filling out the form to the time they get their refund. We would expect that on paper it's going to be longer than if they're filling it out online. Now we start to get into the trickier ones. Incident prevention. As the Office of Digital Strategy, I want to comply with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, so that we don't get sued. How are we going to measure this? Well, the obvious answer is we look at not getting sued. And we hope to see a zero value. This goes back to my recommendation that a good assessment plan is affirmative rather than negative. If the suit rate is 0, if we don't get sued 1 year, does that mean our feature worked? Or is it just fate that we weren't going to get sued no matter what? So for these type features, really I think what we need to do is reframe the assessment in some way that we can test what is rather than what is not. For instance, in this case, instead of the value being we have 0 lawsuits filed against us for accessibility non-compliance, we could instead say our site meets WAI AA certification. It's kind of a presumption that with a AA certification, we're not going to be accessible or exposed to accessibility suits. But in this case, I think we've got a reasonable assumption of that, or it's reasonable to make that assumption, and this is something we can affirmatively verify. We deployed this feature. Before the deployment, our site was WAI, C. We deployed the feature, it's AA. Obviously, feature showing value. And then there are the intangibles. These are the ones that get really weird. For instance, as an agency executive, I want to reference relative regulations in the help text of the form so the public will have greater trust in our agency. Or as an agency executive, I want to comply with the open data mandate so our agency looks better politically. These are really nebulous things and are going to be hard to assess. In the first case, we could go back and try to identify participants in a focus group to see if, in fact, they do have greater trust in us now that we've added these regulations to the form. In the second case, how are we going to say that our agency looks better politically? I would recommend in this case, there are there are really two ways to evaluate these kind of intangibles. Either you want to assess in advance, so do your focus groups up front, do your usability testing up front before developing and deploying the site. And maybe in these cases, especially in the second one, maybe this is one where we play the third exemption in the when do we not need to do a feature value assessment, and say that this is really a regulatory or fiat issue, so we don't need to assess. So let's look at when we want to do a feature assessment or a value assessment. Well, obviously we want to do it shortly after deployment, our initial value assessment. How long shortly after deployment is going to vary based on the feature. You may need to give it several days for people to discover the feature and find out about it and start using it. If this is a feature that is also going to have like press announcements made about it, then maybe you don't need to wait a few days. Maybe you could see use occurring within the first hour. I think the key here is that we don't want to just do that one assessment and walk away. We need to assess repeatedly, periodically. And my recommendation is that how often you reassess should be in proportion to how big of a maintenance burden that feature is. If it's not a big maintenance burden, once a year, once a quarter. If it's something that is a large burden, in terms of either person time, additional development complexity, depending on the feature, could be sheer dollar cost if you need to add servers to support it. So the greater the burden, the more frequently you should be looking at it. Case in point. Several years ago, I worked for a federal agency that deployed a new public engagement tool. You'll have to forgive me for being vague, but I'm still under NDA, so I can talk in vagaries but not details. Anyway, as part of that engagement tool, we wanted to offer an API that we would expose to the public to allow them to submit data to us and also to get data back from us. Well, because if we were to add an API, that meant we had to have a way for people to register for an API key. And we needed a way to rate limit people so that some guy wasn't hammering us with 1 million requests a second. And if they weren't acting nice, we needed a way to revoke those API keys and turn off their access. We had to have documentation of how the API worked. We had to have feedback mechanisms so that they could ask questions, they could say this feature is not working. And we had to have an entire sandbox environment, separate set of servers, separate code, so that there was a place where people could test out their API integrations and play with them without risking, potentially impacting the production environment or, them inadvertently submitting junk data. That meant, in addition to additional servers, we had to add steps to our deployment process because the sandbox had to be kept in sync with the production environment. And if the sandbox was going down for maintenance, we had to send notifications out to let people know, hey, sandbox is going down. But that was kind of exciting stuff to do. Dev team was happy about it. Client was happy about it. We built it, launched it. Use was through the roof. Everybody was happy. The feature wasn't causing any problems. Everybody kind of stopped looking at it. A couple years later, we started looking at, well, how much use is this actually getting? And what we saw in looking at the numbers was that after an initial spike of about a month and a half, the average monthly use was down to 2 users. Because we had evaluated at the beginning and nobody really paid attention to it. So, that was an entirely separate site, whole new features, integrations, really burdensome effort. But for 2 users, to my mind, that's not a lot of value. So, if a feature doesn't meet the expectations after you evaluate it, what do? Well, you got 3 choices. You ignore it, leave the feature alone. I highly recommend not doing this unless, as we've said before, the burden of the feature is 0, in which case you probably didn't want to actually do an assessment of the value afterwards. We could iterate and improve the feature. This would be looking at adding stories to our backlog to make the feature actually do what we expected it to do. Or we could look at removing the feature entirely. So between the second and third, we need to look at the costs of removing the feature versus the costs of maintaining the feature. So we'll look at things like, does the feature depend on outside packages or outside modules? That increases the complexity of trying to remove it. Are there other features on the site that depend on this feature? If this feature is providing no value, but other features that do provide value are dependent on this feature, we can't take out the one without impacting the other. Yes?
In your example that you were giving, was the feature a standalone feature? I didn't quite understand that.
The API?
Yeah, the API.
Yeah.
So it was completely standalone.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can use it. It was to be used independently of anything else.
Yes. It was just another way of accessing what was set up as like a website system. Where was I? Oh yeah. So look at what it's going to cost you to remove the feature versus what it's going to cost you to continue to maintain it. And when you're looking at how much it's going to cost to remove, one thing I would make sure you think about is if you're removing a feature that provides a URL, think about it that you need to add redirects so that somebody hitting that URL doesn't just get a 404 page. It's one of those little things, easy to overlook, not a huge deal, but it makes people sad if suddenly they start getting a 404. So my overall recommendation, if the cost to maintain a feature is equal or greater than the cost to remove it, get rid of it. So, quick summary. We should be doing a value assessment as part of, or a value assessment plan as part of every feature that we're building out. Whether we build that in at the feature level or at the individual story is a judgment call, and you have to kind of assess based on the story and the feature itself. But it should be a part of every hunk of work that we're developing on a site. As the product owners, it's on us to do this assessment repeatedly after deployment. It's not enough just to do it once and be done. You need to keep looking at it over and over again. When in doubt, kill it. And, please think of the kittens. Every time you don't do an assessment, a cute kitten somewhere dies. Questions? Yeah.
So, how would you recommend approaching this whole concept to an audience that comes from kind of the old school set it and forget it worlds, where the idea of removing anything is just what? We didn't do that in Dreamweaver, that sort of thing.
Well, I think you've got to The more fundamental issue there is if they're, old school, deploy and walk away, they're probably not really getting the idea of the product owner in the first place. The idea that the product owner's job is to live with this or whatever it is you're building and love it for the long term. So I think you probably have some more basic questions and more basic discussions that need to happen about, how do we go from the idea of we're just going to put up a website and that's done and now we go on to other things, to the idea that we've put up this website, but that's not the end of it. It's going to be updated, it's going to be nurtured, it'll evolve over time. And if it's not something that that they see enough value in to do that kind of long-term nurturing, maybe there's not really value in having it.
The nurturing part, I think, is understood, and because we have people that we assign to this stuff that will constantly work with each business and say, okay, what's working well for you, what's not. But there's not really that aspect of data of how many people, like actual citizens or site visitors are using this feature, and maybe the lady who runs the site really wants it, but no one is actually using that, and that, I guess that's more of a political question, I suppose. I don't know.
So the product owner wants
thinks that, there might be one person or two people who are using this, and it's enough that that's enough. We should keep it, but the cost of maintaining is pretty high, and I guess this is more of how do you argue the case there, kind of the intangibles.
Yeah. So those kind of questions, I'm always going to try to go back to, the raw facts and the raw numbers. Our maintenance burden for this particular feature is, we add development complexity, try to estimate that in terms of time. Every deployment takes us an additional 45 minutes. This slows down our tickets by, 6 hours a ticket. Because the closer you can get to cost in dollars or burden in dollars, and the number of users and the value to those users, it's going to be a lot easier to explain for some of the C-levels or the execs that aren't used to this kind of thinking, why they need to take another look at it. Yes?
Sometimes our team develops MVPs.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that work with this when you're developing an MVP?
So, the MVP should be, generally the MVP is written to story spec, right? And when we're writing those stories and figuring out what exactly is MVP, we're making an estimate of what the value of those stories is. But until the story is deployed and we're actually able to see it live, we don't, in most cases, know that that the story is actually providing the value that we estimated it as. Yes?
Is it MVP, needs assessment, or what's the acronym? That you
MVP?
use? Okay.
Minimum viable product.
Oh, MVP. Okay,
Yes.
I thought you said MVP. Okay.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I'll be around if anybody wants to talk offline. Otherwise, have a great day. Thank you all for coming.